There is tremendous heartbreak in the world. And since we last spoke, the obvious surface of suffering has increased in the world. Violence is what we do when we don't know what to do with our suffering. You are not safe if I am not safe. And there's something very, very, very powerful in holding on to that observation.
What do you think is the role of our ancestors and the generations before us?
We can ask ourselves, what would our ancestors want us to do today? I don't know of any spiritual or philosophical tradition that says, always put hate front and center. I think most of our spiritual traditions say put love front and center.
Then you spoke about create belonging. How can we introduce this term that the way to deal with suffering and violence is to create belonging in the society?
The thing that strikes me is that longing to belong is universal and defines us as human beings.
Why are we so blind? How come I'm not been able to see that my inability to connect with others is less to do with who they are? It's more to do with my own connection with my own self.
Because it's too painful to look at myself. I'm not talking about the eradication of suffering. Not fix it, but to be with it. I am supposed to be with your suffering. You are supposed to be with my suffering.
Hey, welcome, Jerry. Such a pleasure having you here again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me again. As I said just before we got started, maybe today we'll solve all the world's problems in our conversation.
Think that we have solved the world's problem, but then suddenly something appeared, and you know what's happening in the world, right? Between Israel and Palestine, and then the Ukraine, we could not solve that. We could hardly solve that. So now let's bring Jerry Colonna on the show one more time.
I'll do my best.
Yes. Jerry, let me start with one question that I've learned from you. And I don't know how many times I've shared this with people, that if only you could ask people, how are you? In a way that people can relate to you, where people can feel you in that question, where people can see you in that question, where people can hear you in that question, they might get tears in their eyes.
Yeah, isn't that true? So I'm mixed. I live in a beautiful spot. I am loved. I am safe. I have this book coming out in a few weeks, which is exciting for me. Feels like fruition. I got married in September. My daughter got engaged in August. My youngest son is getting married in December. I turned 60 in December. So there's fruition. And last night, I was on the phone late into the evening with a friend, an American, whose ancestral lineage goes back to Palestine in the West Bank. Tonight, I will be on the phone with a friend who is Egyptian, who came to the United States seeking political asylum after protesting against his government. And there is tremendous heartbreak in the world. And, you know, as I said to a friend last night, if you and I know that I consider myself a student of the Buddha. And one of the most important teachings is what we refer to as bodhicitta, open heart. And the thing about open heart is that it hurts. You know, when we open our heart to the suffering of the world, it hurts. And since we last spoke, the obvious surface of suffering has increased in the world. And the last thing I'll say is, the new book seeks to create an understanding or reimagining of what leadership means. And I seek to encourage people to expand their notion of leadership from power to creating what I refer to as systemic belonging.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And right now, there's a greater need for that than there ever was before. And that makes me sad. So that's how I am.
Thank you for sharing that, Jerry. And just for the benefit of our audience who are listening to this podcast and may not have heard the other 2 times that you have been on this podcast, I would strongly recommend all of you to just go and listen to those 2 podcasts as well. Jerry is an author of not only 1, but 2 books. The last book that he wrote was Reboot. And I promise you, it's one of the finest scripts that you would read. 2 statements that stayed with me, Jerry, from that last book was, one was, as you mentioned, if only I could ask people how they are from a space of spaciousness, expansiveness, heartfulness, they might get tears in their eyes because all of us are carrying so much of pain within us. And we don't have an outlet to share that with others. That's one. The second thing that resonated most with me during our last conversation was when you mentioned how you lead is who you are. And now we are taking one step forward and we are going to explore what it means to be a leader from a space of systemic connections. And in today's polarized worlds where leaders are increasingly challenged to address the risk of division and separation, it's becoming more and more important that we need to revisit what it means to belong again. And that's what we are going to explore today. The book, Reunion, Leadership, and Longing to Belong. Help me understand, Jerry, what led you to write a book called Reunion, Leadership, and the Longing to Belong?
Well, it was the summer of 2020 here in the United States. If you recall that time, we were at the beginning of this pandemic period. And for me personally, it felt an incredibly scary time, a challenging time. It did not seem that our scientists would get the virus under control. It did not seem that we would be safe to gather again. And in the United States, in late May, the police stopped an unarmed Black man named George Floyd. And for 7.5, 8 minutes, one officer kept a knee on his neck, and he died of asphyxiation. And like a lot of people during that summer, protests broke out all over the place. And protests broke out in Brooklyn, New York, where my daughter happened to be. And one night, I started getting text messages from my daughter, who was in the midst of 5,000 people who were marching from Brooklyn to Manhattan in New York City over a bridge. And she started texting me because the police had closed in from behind them and were closing in from the front of them. And they started pepper spraying. And I was safe on a farm in Colorado. And, or as I like to say, I was safe in this body, this white, cisgender, straight male body. And here was my 30-year-old daughter putting herself on the line against injustice, against murder, against division and separation. And what I came to realize was that, my first book, Reboot, one of the central tenets is that better humans or better people make better leaders. And that is true. But if the definition of a better person stops at just this one body, then it seems insufficient.
Precisely.
That's what was the prompt for writing the book.
Yeah, yeah. And when you said that I was safe, male, white, straight man, you have done a lot of work in the space of radical self-inquiry, Jerry. And the moment you said I was safe, I literally questioned the definition of I. Unless we revisit this definition of I, we will never be safe. Help me understand what shifted for you when you thought that you need to bring in some awareness in the world around radical self-inquiry and the belonging at the systemic level.
I think that's a very, very profound question and observation, Gaurav. I think you're right. The I was safe construct is quite ego bound, isn't it? And it's quite narrow in its confines. And in a sense, it denies the interbeingness of all of us. And I think you're quite right that part of the understanding of belonging. See, in my first book, one of the things I explored is the way in which we all seek love, safety, and belonging. But in the second book, what I really try to do is to really expand upon that notion and see the universal wish for belonging, in a sense, as an expression of our interconnectedness. And so I would answer back to your observation. I think you're right implicitly. I am not safe if you are not safe. You are not safe if I am not safe. And there's something very, very, very powerful in holding on to that observation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've always said that people have the basic desire to connect with others. If I may say, the basic desire of a human soul is to express self from a space of the unique gifts that they have been blessed with, the talents that they have been given, the traits that they have been provided so that we can serve the world. And the second one is our desire to connect with others and our desire to contribute to the other people. And from there, as much as that's a human desire, I'm just wondering, when people start to operate from a space of separatedness, when people start to operate from a space of othering, right? Who gets benefited from that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that that's the most useful line of inquiry in looking at this. You made the observation before that we have an increasingly polarized world, and that we have political leadership that doesn't seem to be addressing this. But I would argue, more importantly, what they seem to be doing is exacerbating. And I think that part of what we see on a continuous basis is the quite human fear of someone who is different, fear of the other, being weaponized into hatred. And that hatred leads to violence. And I'll close with one observation. I've been talking now for months about these sorts of themes. And a question that people often ask me is, why is it so important right now? And I will say somewhat dramatically, because babies are being killed. Babies, children are being killed. Now, this is not the first time in humanity. I'm speaking to you, you're in India. India very well knows sectarian strife, right? The United States, in some ways, is built on pitting one group against another group. And so babies have been killed for millennia. But I'm going to speak strongly about this. Babies. Babies. And so you asked who benefits. I think it's people who are in power. I think people manipulate fear into hatred so that they may maintain
The status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. This is really interesting because it's not the first time that we are experiencing this. We are not experiencing the hatred, the jealousy, the violence for the first time. What do you think is the role of our ancestors and the generations before us that has led us to be where we are right now? And by no means I'm trying to externalize this challenge. I'm just saying that when a Black is born in America, they still have some kind of trauma that they're born with. There's a lot of researches that has been done that how this fear cascades from one generation to another, and it continues to stay in your DNA for 3, 4, 5 generations.
No, I think you're grasping at the right issues. And I wrote about this in Reunion. I think that looking at where we are in the world today by looking backwards to our ancestors is a possible path forward. So, and I think that understanding the experience of our ancestors, as I say in the book, the real experience, not the myths that we tell about our ancestors, but the real experience of our ancestors can be helpful for us. On the one hand, you're absolutely right. The notion of intergenerational trauma showing up, and I would argue that that's another form of weaponization, or that's another area that gets weaponized. And so your family, because of its religious beliefs, may have experienced previous generations being murdered because of their religious beliefs. Unfortunately, that's all too common occurrence in the world. And so the descendants have that effectively in their body. And then when a member of the group or tribe that inflicted that pain and suffering on my ancestors rises up, the impulse is for revenge and retaliation. And the cycle of violence continues. But really, what's been going on is a lack of processing of that trauma, a lack of being able to put it away. My teacher and friend Parker Palmer is fond of saying that violence is what we do when we don't know what to do with suffering. So there's that aspect. But I want to bring your attention to something else, which is that our ancestors and their wisdom traditions may have suffered, but I believe that there's something powerful when we can step into their experience using our imagination, our empathetic imagination, and we can ask ourselves, what would our ancestors want us to do today? Would they want us to live with hate and revenge in our heart? I don't know of any spiritual or philosophical tradition that says always put hate front and center. I think most of our spiritual traditions say put love front and center. And so if I imagine my ancestors having processed their suffering and gotten to a place in a kind of interpersonal experience of being able to say, what would they like me, their descendant, to do? I think they want me to love. I think they want me to create belonging, even for those who have hurt me.
Yeah. I love it when you said that violence is something that we do when we don't know what we do with our sufferings. As much as I hear you, that our ancestors would not want us to operate from a space of violence, they would not want us to suffer. But at the same time, when we're talking about intergenerational traumas, I believe they cannot be dealt with at the cognitive level. So as much as I understand that it cannot be dealt with at the cognitive level, and they would not want me to operate from a space of violence, and it becomes a vicious circle. Then you spoke about create belonging. Now, here's my question. One, how can we introduce this term that the way to deal with suffering and violence is to create belonging in the society? That's one. How can we build that awareness?
Well, to the first question, how can I help create those conditions? I go back to a construct. If you remember from Reboot, I had a very powerful question that I promulgated, which was, how have I been complicit, not responsible, complicit in creating the conditions in my life that I say I don't want? And that is a very, very powerful and opening question. Now, when we take that question and we expand it and we say, how have I been complicit in and benefited from the division, the separation, the othering that I say I don't want to see, it becomes a powerful tool to realize. You asked a very important question before. Who benefits? Well, guess what? Sometimes we benefit from the very conditions that we say we don't want to see. So that's step one. Step two is to understand the root of the most powerful emotion we have, compassion. Okay, so let's break down the English word compassion. It breaks down into two Latin words, com, to be with, passion, feelings. Okay, the implicit instruction in that word is, we go back to Parker's assertion. Violence is what we do when we don't know what to do with our suffering. Do you know what we're supposed to do with our suffering? Be with it. I am supposed to be with your suffering. You are supposed to be with my suffering. Not fix it, not eradicate it, not revenge it, but to be with it, to hold you, to stand side by side with you. Now, imagine that this is how we responded to war. Imagine this is how we responded when babies are killed. Imagine the belonging that would flourish as a result of that. Okay, I'm not talking about the eradication of suffering. I'm talking about how to be with each other in a way where you are my brother. I am your brother. And we have physically never met. That's belonging.
I'm just being with what you said, what you just mentioned, that we don't need to deal with somebody's suffering. We just need to be with somebody's suffering. And it reminds me of a book that I read long time back by Eckhart Tolle, where he talks about ego. And he talks about the body ego that we all have. Ego that gets triggered when I experience a sense of separation. And when I feel that there's something that I'm going to lose in this moment. And you mentioned that we get benefited. I'm just wondering if there's any connection that you hear.
I think you're right. There's an ego aggrandizement that happens, that can happen when I see myself as separate and above the other. And like so many teachings, it's kind of a false God, if you will, right? Because it provides temporary relief from the fear that I am alone, that I am worthless, that I am unlovable. But the relief, and all wisdom teachings teach this, the relief is temporary. That sustained, persistent relief from suffering stems from letting go of the attachment to that ego construct and replacing it, if you will, here's a word you'll like, with connection.
And if my memory supports me, in your book, you have spoken about a concept called code switching and how it restricts an individual to connect with the intrinsic source of completion and being whole, right? Tell me more about that.
Well, it's a term used to describe the way in which a person will shapeshift in order to fit into a dominant culture. So it might be women adopting certain ways of being in order to fit into a male dominant work environment. Or it may be someone who identifies as Black in the United States adopting a way of speaking that sounds white to the dominant culture, so I can fit in.
Yeah, yeah.
And the question then becomes, well, what's lost, right? Think of immigrants from one part of, say, I know part of our audience is in India, one part of India to another part of India, and sublimating, say, my religious beliefs so that I can fit in to the dominant culture of the region that I've just emigrated to. That's the code switch. What gets lost is connection to self.
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm picking up right now, Jerry, is that one of the central themes of this book called Reunion is around connection, right? And what I'm also listening is that it's important, it's becoming more and more important that we need to come back home. It reminds me of what Ramdas said, that we all are walking each other home. And now I'm looking at this complete concept of connection and a sense of belonging through the lens of the corporate leaders that you work with, I work with, most of our listeners work with. How do these two concepts come together?
Well, if we look at the suffering that's in our organizations and we look at what our colleagues and our employees are asking of us as leaders, what they're asking for is not just a viable, profitable container. They're asking for a deeper sense of purpose. What they're asking for, to use your word, is deeper sense of connection. And I argue that those of us who seek to provide that without first doing our own work of reuniting and reconnecting with ourselves run the risk of performative work, right? Of making a statement in support of some oppressed organization or people that rings hollow. Because we haven't come to our own relationship with our own experience of othering or being othered. Whether it's patriarchy, an anti-religious sentiment, racism, a focus on caste, a focus on any of these things feeds that separation. And we have to do our work. How have I been complicit in creating the conditions in the world that I say I do not want?
Yeah, yeah. Jerry, help me understand. Looking at the complete concept of reunion, connection, a sense of belonging, being complete and whole within, through the lens of the corporate arena that we are dancing in, how does one not being connected with self impact their connection with others?
You asked before about, or we got into this notion of extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Okay. So when a leader is connected to self, even the parts of ourself that we'd really rather not acknowledge exist, my impatience, for example, my my anger, my capacity for anger. When we are disconnected from that, our efforts to connect to another person are mediated through a mask. You know, you opened up and you asked about this whole question of how are you? Well, implicit in that is the notion that the person responding connects to self. And so that when two people respond from a connected place, what ends up happening is authentic connection between the two. So it is a vital step in creating a sense of belonging within your organization to acknowledge and reunite with the parts of yourself that you have disconnected.
Yeah. Yeah. And it shows up in terms of blaming others that they are not connecting with us, when deep down I'm not being able to connect with my own self.
That's right.
You know, why are we so blind? How come I'm not being able to see that my inability to connect with others is less to do with who they are and how they are? It's more to do with my own connection with my own self.
Because it's too painful to look at myself. I often say, you know, the term I've used for years is radical self inquiry. What makes it radical is the fact that we don't do it. And the obvious question is, why not? And we don't do it because it's painful, right? We have developed methods to numb ourselves from the pain that exacerbate our disconnection from other people. And for those of us who have power in a dominant structure, we exacerbate the pain that others feel because we are unwilling to connect with our authentic self. We are unwilling to reunite with ourselves.
But Jerry, help me understand, when I'm not being able to build strong relationship with my team members, with my family members, because of whatever reasons, I'm not being able to build good connections with my team members, with my family members, with all people who are around me. Isn't that painful? I find that really painful.
Yeah. So it is very, very painful. I'm going to give you a teaching that one of my Buddhist teachers once gave me. When we encounter someone who we want to apply a label, that person is so angry, that person is so violent, that person is so bad. Okay. His teaching was to just insert the phrase, just like me, at the start of that. Just like me. Gaurav gets impatient. Just like me. Gaurav seems to mask his fear with aggression. Just like me. Gaurav is scared. Just like me, Gaurav wants connection. You see what it does?
It melts.
Yeah.
It gives you relief. You experience lightness in your heart.
But we don't want, if I said to you, here's the teaching, talk about all the ways you're negative. I am angry. I am sad. I am this. But we don't want to do that. We can flip it around. Just like me, when I get scared, Gaurav also masks his fear with aggression. Then we're connected.
We are connected. We are connected. Jerry, from here, my mind is taking me to two different directions. One is all the people who are going for creating more wealth for themselves, getting more recognitions and name and fame for themselves. Where are they operating from? That's one question that I have. The second question is, how can a leader in the corporate world transition from a sense of separation, a sense of othering, a sense of me versus you, to the other side of the bridge, where I'm willing to connect with my own self. These are the two directions my mind is taking me. And we have got another 10 minutes. I don't know which one would you like to pick up?
Well, let me see. I'll just respond what occurs to me. I think that one of the most important things is that notion of just like me. Um, it's a powerful way to start to understand the world. You know, in Reunion, one of the stories I tell is that following the release of my first book, Reboot, so many people came up to me and said some version or another after hearing me or reading about me telling my stories about my own upbringing. So many people came up to me and said some form or another of your story is my story. There was that expression of a universal understanding. And I think that what happens is that part of the learned behavior that we have, the way we have been socialized to deal with our own suffering, is we create this bubble around us. And so we use this phrase unconsciously, only me. Only I struggle as a CEO, right? I've been coaching now for 20 years. I can't tell you the relief that comes when I can finally get a client to understand that they're not the only one who struggles, right? You know that feeling. Or when I'm working with a leader and working with an organization that has tension and disruption in it, and we start to hone in on the shared wishes. Oh, you would like to just pay your bills and send your children to a good school and come home at night and not feel exhausted, just like me? You know, lastly, in the second piece of this universal wish for longing, I want to read a quote that I opened the new book with, which is from the American theologian Frederick Buechner. And he wrote this in a beautiful book called The Longing for Home. And he said, there lies the longing to know and be known by another fully and humanly. And that beneath that, there lies a longing closer to the heart of the matter still, which is the longing to be at long last where you fully belong. Now, there's so much that's beautiful about that quote. The thing that strikes me is that that longing to belong is universal and defines us as human beings. And when we start to see our colleagues, our competitors, our spouses, our children, the people in the other religious group down the road from us as human beings who simply want to belong, I think it becomes impossible to dehumanize them, throw them on the other side of that wall of separation. It creates the possibility of embracing them.
Yeah, yeah. Such a beautiful quote. And so well stated, Jerry, I think. Very clearly, you've been able to emphasize on this deep need and desire of a human soul to connect with others and belong. And what would you suggest are the possible steps for a leader to cross that bridge and embrace connectedness, embrace a sense of belonging?
First of all, you have to overcome your fear of helplessness. You have to overcome your fear of being wrong. Too many leaders shy away from doing this work because they don't want to be criticized. They don't want to be corrected. Second, you have to do the work of understanding to whom and to where you belong. And for some, that may mean like it was for me in the story I tell in the book, reconnecting with my long lost ancestors who, for various reasons, I disconnected from, pain and suffering being the primary one, so that I can then hear the wish, the longing to belong of those around me. It's a multi step process. Radical self inquiry. How am I wired? What am I doing? In effect, if you want, read Reboot and then read Reunion.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend that for sure.
Right.
Jerry, having written two books, I think they are masterpieces in themselves, Reboot and Reunion. Where are you struggling in your life to connect with? And yet there's something which is coming in the way.
It doesn't feel quite like that. What it feels like is, well, I said before that having bodhicitta, having an open heart, is painful. And so the struggle, it hurts. The struggle I can feel right now is I see the pain of othering and separation everywhere now. And the truth is, I didn't always see that. And I don't want that pain to go away.
I can so much relate to that. A few years back, I could not see the pain in myself coming from a space of othering. I thought it's smartness in me that's keeping me away from the less intelligent ones around me. It's only now I can see the pain of separatedness, the pain coming from a space of othering. At the same time, something which is even more painful is when I see the suffering in my close friends, in my family members, because deep down, I know they are operating from a space of othering. They are operating from a space of suffering, because of which what I could sense is a sense of pain, anger, violence. And that's where I asked you that question, that when I know it's causing trouble in my relationships, how could I be so blind? And as you mentioned, because radical self-inquiry is painful. Jerry, thank you so much for sharing who you are.
Thank you for having me.
And as I mentioned, we cannot have enough of you. Would be an absolute pleasure to have you again sometime. Can't wait to have you in India. Shukran. Take care. Bye-bye.
Care. Bye now.